This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello and welcome to the 50th episode of the Photographing the West podcast. To celebrate our 50th episode, we're doing a special giveaway. So stay tuned to the end to learn how you can win a sweatshirt or hoodie of your choice from my Amazon store. Once again, I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. Twice a month, we bring you interviews with interesting people doing interesting things. Most are photographers, but some are experts in related fields. Today, I have a very special guest for you, nature and wildlife photographer, Brenda Tharp. Welcome back to Photographing the West, Brenda.
Thanks, Kirby. It's great to be back.
Great to have you back. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about was your approach to nature and wildlife photography. Most of us, at least I started with the Ansel Adams approach of F64 with everything in focus and sharp. And there's certainly something to be said for that. I still like to do that a lot, but you've moved past that to talk about or to do other approaches, which are equally interesting and beautiful. So talk about that a bit.
Well, I also did start with that same Ansel Adams F64 approach. The complete depth field really made such sense when you were photographing the grand landscapes, having that rock in the foreground all the way back to the mountains or the moon, having them all sharp was and still is really important for those big landscapes. And I still love to create those because they do celebrate the grandeur of our world. But I've been drawn to the intimate landscape for a long time. And ironically, that intimate landscape may or may not be complete depth of field, sharp front to back. Most often, my intimate landscapes still benefit from absolute sharpness because I'm doing studies of the forest floor, the patterns and textures that are there, or it may be lichens on a rock surrounded by autumn leaves. Whatever that subject matter is, it's still a pretty realistic representation of the natural world. And I think that for those types of images, total depth of field really works. But selective focus, shallower depth of field also really works effectively when you want to isolate a subject and simplify the background. And in some ways, you're still suggesting that depth, but you're creating such a focus or a focal point on what is sharp that is different than in the total depth of field sharp images of other subject matter. And I like to do both in that regard. I find that as my connection to nature deepens, that I'm drawn in closer to a lot of things. And while I've done quite a bit of macro in my time, I'm not doing so much of that right now, but I'm still really drawn to take that grand landscape and parcel it up into the smaller, intimate things that can be found within that if you take the time to explore it.
So you're also a wildlife photographer, and a lot of times we're told that you need that 600 millimeter lens in order to get good wildlife photos. Are there other approaches to that?
Well, there are, and one is that I advocate is getting closer to the wildlife, gaining their trust so that you can get closer. Not only helps in terms of not having to carry such huge lenses and all that heavy gear, which is a plus, but it also can give you a more intimate experience that you're capturing on the sensor. And of course, I'm advocating safety first, so you don't just want to walk up to a bison in Yellowstone just because you can and use your 24/70, but you can still especially in areas where animals have habituated to humans, you can often get closer as long as you're paying attention and respecting that at some point you might change their behavior and then you've gotten too close. And that allows you to use 100, 400 millimeters, sometimes the 70 to 200 millimeter, depending on the critter or animal that you're photographing. So a case in point, when I photograph my bears in Alaska, where I take my groups for a workshop, the bears over several generations have habituated to humans being around. There's several lodges that's within a national park, and every day during the season, there are probably 100 or 200 people spread out, but in the field observing these bears going about their daily lives. And so the young ones have gotten very used to it from the time that they're brought out of the woods onto the salt flats and the tidal flats. And they get used to us. And that has made it really special and very easy to get great photographs of these bears without needing heavy-duty equipment. In fact, one time I was there with a fixed 500, and all of my participants had 100 400s, and I had to back up and leave the group in order to use my lens because we were too close for that power. And so the following trip, I brought my 100 400 zoom, and I did bring at that time, I think I had just purchased my 150 to 600, so I was using it, but I wasn't at 600 very often, as it turns out, looking at the metadata. So that's one way. And I think being in a location where the animals are a little bit more habituated, you do get an intimate view. It gives you the opportunity to get down on your knees or lie down on your stomach on the beach sand to photograph the birds, and you're not deemed as much of a threat as when you might be just standing up with your big heavy lens on a tripod.
So you're talking about Lake Clark, I assume.
Yeah, I am actually. Yeah, it's like, one of the most popular places, but it's not the only place. I mean, people are taking a lot of photo cruises on the Katmai Peninsula, and they're photographing from small boats. A little bit trickier, and some of them get ashore, but they are also able to get close because the bears are not perceiving them as a threat sitting in this. In fact, they probably look like sitting ducks because the bear could capsize the little dinghy in a heartbeat, but the bears are not threatened by it. And so, there definitely are other places besides Lake Clark where you can get a lot closer because they've really gotten used to us.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a great experience. That's on my to-do list. I've been to Katmai, which was very interesting and fun as well, but not quite the same as going to Lake Clark, I don't think.
Yeah. I think part of it, and it actually worries me a little bit. I love the place, but one of the other lodges had an experience where a woman was standing in the driveway of the lodge, and a bear was coming towards her, but she wasn't worried and it didn't seem threatening. And for reasons that I still can't understand, she let it walk by her very close, so close that it reached around and swatted her with its paw and tore the back of her calf up, and she had to go to the hospital. And then she came out, and a couple months later she was back in for infections. And I don't know what the end story was there, but that to me was just foolishness on the part of a guest who, when we get that close to animals, people tend to forget that they're still wild animals and are unpredictable. And this bear was probably doing it as a show of dominance. It wasn't this, oh, I'm going to get this human being. It was just a show of dominance, giving a little swat as it went by, like, hey, you're in my way, as if it were another bear. But of course it wasn't. And you hear stories like that in Yellowstone as well, where people have just gotten too close to the wildlife because the wildlife have gotten very used to us. So, but another method is also using your car as a blind wherever you have that opportunity. And I know Melissa Grew, who's an excellent wildlife photographer, has used her car as a photo blind. And she might be using a 600 or 500, but, with a bean bag and a car support, window support or something, she's able to get a lot closer. So she might not even need that length lens many times because the car serves as a perfect blind.
Yeah, I know that works real well for some people. It's never worked very well for me, but yeah, you got to do what works for you.
True.
Yeah. So one of the axioms of nature photography is that nature is chaotic, and certainly that's the case more some places than others. But how do you learn to simplify a photo so that it's more appealing and doesn't look like a mess and where the eye doesn't know where to go?
Good question, because nature is really messy in a lot of cases. And so it's especially wonderful when you discover something where nature seems to have put things in such a tidy manner that all you have to do is keep your edges clean and you've got a composition. I wish all of it was that easy, but of course we both know it's not. More times than not, nature is cluttered and there's a lot going on. And so I internalize this, but I ask myself, well, what's the essence of the scene? What stopped me to take a further look at the scene that's in front of me? And often when I ask myself that question, the answers will come. It might be, I really like the pattern on that rock, or wow, that is really cool bark on that tree, and those answers then define what I'm going to spend more time focusing on and composing as my subject. And that helps me then figure out, okay, well, I'm going to need a deep f-stop or a shallow f-stop, to keep the clutter from being a clutter. If I use, shallower depth of field, what position do I need to be to try and simplify it and bring out the strength of what it is I'm seeing? Do I want to fill the frame with the pattern of the bark on the tree, or do I want to have that close to the lens but still have the environment that tree is in the background? And so there's a lot of internalized thought going on. And some people in my workshops have said, how do you get to the final shot with all that going on? But it becomes second nature after a while. It's like we all know what we like. We all know what appeals to us. And that may be different for you than it is for me. But what stops us in our tracks is in there somewhere. If it's not readily evident as a clean shot presented to us by Mother Nature, then we still manage to see something in the mess, if you will, that appealed to us. And just by walking around and thinking about it and looking through the viewfinder, you suddenly get that aha moment, like, there, this really celebrates what I was attracted to. And I have a picture as an example that I've titled Channeling Autumn, and it's maple and oak leaves in Zion that have fallen into a depression in the sandstone in a wash that I was exploring. And there were leaves everywhere in that wash. But this depression concentrated them in such a way that it emphasized the piling up of leaves as they fall to earth. And so rather than showing a bigger snippet of this wash with leaves scattered everywhere, and along with that were branches and other rocks that might have tumbled down from above, I found a way to just simplify this one little gully that all the leaves had sort of, or most of them, had fallen into, and there's a few up on the sides of it that hadn't yet been blown in, and I felt like that told my story.
Yeah, that's a great photo. I was looking at that this morning, and the leaves kind of provide their own leading line, plus there's kind of leading lines in the sandstone as well. So
yeah. So, I mean, that was nature. That wasn't me, but I was there to see it, and I'm grateful for that.
So one of the other things you teach is seeing the picture within the picture. How do you learn to do that with nature and wildlife photography?
Well, with nature, it's kind of like I just described, where I just really spend some time asking myself, what is the most attractive part of this scene in front of me, and distilling it down to being just that. Because there are always pictures within pictures. And sometimes in that, and this kind of gets back to that idea of the intimate landscape versus the grand landscape. Within the grand landscape, there's probably 6 intimate landscapes or more, that countless intimate landscapes that you could make from that big scene. So often after I've done the big scene, which might be during dramatic light and, dramatic weather and so forth, I spend more time exploring and narrowing my field of view down to a more intimate view, wandering around and looking at all of the things that are within that scene, that together all of those made up the big picture. And so knowing that there's pictures within a picture, I teach that from a standpoint that most people say, wow, look at that colorful hillside, and they just frame up a shot and they've got all these autumn foliage colors on the trees and everything, and that's great. But, when I'm reviewing those images, often I will say, but look how much stronger it would be if you had just these 3 tree trunks with autumn color all around them. Those 3 tree trunks may be the structure that the photograph needed as a sort of resting point for the eye, and then all the fall color around it tells the story of the seasons and so forth. And the big picture did that too, but maybe doesn't have as much of a direction for the eye. So you get wandering and you kind of get lost in all of the riot of fall color, and yet there's no place to really rest, or no place to call home, as I like to say often. So, I try to teach people to look within the picture that they've just made. Make that picture, get it out of your system, and then look again and see if there isn't a way you can clean it up, tighten it up, narrow it down to where you still have all the elements that tell the story you want to tell, but in a better structured way. Now with wildlife, as if we could do that, it's, if there's action going on, then you're just really busy trying to capture the action, and you still have always running in the back of your head, you should have composition, being thought about, and it's intuitive after a while. Like, okay, if the animal is running, I want to make sure that I've left lots of room for them to run into the scene, into the frame, and not running up against the edge of the frame. So there's some basic compositional things like that that are always being applied even as you're tracking an animal. But a lot of times with wildlife, the picture is really a moment or a gesture, something that is beyond the trophy portrait or the standard shot, that tells a story about the behavior, something a little bit more about the animal. So an example is a mother bear nursing her cubs. That's not an easy photograph to get, because 9 times out of 10, she'll decide to nurse them with her back facing to us, or you get a side shot and she rolls down and there she goes, disappearing into the grasses, and there go the cubs with her. And so you can hear it and you know that there's this wonderful moment going on, but you can't see it for all the blades of grass that are in the meadow. And so it takes a lot of persistence and luck and repeat visits to where you finally get clean shots. And luck is really a big part of that too. So this one shot that I included here for you was a mother who was watching the river, hoping for fish. They were just starting to come in, and so whenever she heard a slap, she would be really focused. Well, the babies don't care so much, so when they're hungry, they come over and they were begging, and so she thought, okay, there's not much happening. I'll just let you nurse right here. And so it couldn't have been a cleaner background. It's just the river out of focus, and the two little cubs are climbing on her and suckling away, and she's got her head curled up looking at them. And there's that anthropomorphizing that we do, but her paw is up, and often there's that gesture that is so endearing, and you know that she cares in her own bear way very deeply for those cubs like we do for our own offspring. And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to find as a picture within the picture. Long-winded, but hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I saw that shot as well, and it's a great shot, one that I'd love to have. I think listening to one of your talks, a lot of your shots these days are handhold. Am I right about that?
I'm not sure where I would have said that, except in my travel photography. When I'm doing street photography in Morocco or in Spain or in Cuba, the tripod is in the hotel room, or better, it's attached to the bottom of my bag that I'm carrying around, because every now and then there's a shot I really want that isn't on the fly, it isn't people moment oriented, and I need more depth of field or a slower shutter speed. So I have the tripod with me, and it's a very lightweight travel tripod that is easy to carry around without getting fatigued. But for nature, let me back up and say for wildlife photography, a lot of it, by the very nature of your subject, a lot of it ends up being handheld if you're trying for those stories and those moments. And so that bear cubs nursing shot ironically ended up being on a tripod, because they were nursing. It was calm, it was low light. There wasn't a lot of action, and so I had the tripod with me. We all did, and so we just set our tripods up, and we just didn't even have to change the composition really. We just kept shooting when moments of the bears would lift their heads or so forth. Now, when a bear is running through the stream chasing a fish, the tripod gets in the way for me. So again, it's by my side, but I'm hand holding so I can follow that activity of the bear much easier. And the same thing when I was in Botswana recently, doing a lot of work from boats in the delta and the river channels. One of the participants with me tried to work off her tripod, but it really was not conducive to that. The only way that works is if you are in this super outfitted boat that's got gimbal heads and posts and swivel seats and everything, so you can move in any direction. And boy, that's great. But 9 times out of 10, you're in a flat bottom dinghy and you're floating amongst the reeds, and a kingfisher appears with a fish in its mouth, and you're going to handhold and get that shot. So wildlife, it kind of depends on the situation. The rest of my images, I would say, of nature are primarily on a tripod, because I think that helps you focus your intent more, so your compositions are stronger, it slows you down, it makes you think about it, and you can take a shot and look at it and say, okay, is there anything else that I want to do here or anything different that I might want to do. And handheld, you can get close, but you'll never get exactly the same photo. So what good is it to say, oh, I need to move a little left, because you still might cut off the end of the branch, if you're not careful in that hand holding.
Yeah, very true. Conversely, is it still necessary with today's cameras and lenses to use a tripod as much as we used to 5-10 years ago?
I personally am of the opinion that it's still important. And yes, we have higher ISO capabilities with less noise. I'll grant you that. And that is wonderful for a lot of wildlife photography, because if it is handheld, your shutter speed has to be up there. And that means your ISO is up there. And it's not uncommon for me, working off the National Geographic ships with Lindblad, we're stopped in the water, but we're not off the boat. And so we're drifting still. And I'm up at, 3200 ISO in order to freeze the motion of a mother moose and her calf walking in the water, and so thankfully the higher noise management of our cameras, those capabilities have saved us. But I don't want to use those high ISOs if I don't have to, because it's still having to do noise management. Noise management, as good as it is still a compromise over the ability to use lower ISOs. And so for my still lifes, if you will, my nature, my intimate landscapes and my grand landscapes, most of them I am still doing on the tripod. And again, because I also want that repeatable framing. When I get a shot that I really like, I won't take just one. Even if I nailed the exposure, and the histogram looks great, I'm going to take 6 or 7, because I have sadly discovered that I have had images that, for reasons unbeknownst to me, are now corrupt in my Lightroom catalog. And yet I have 5 other copies of that same image, thankfully. And I have backup raw files that are hopefully still good, but haven't had to go and look, So I want to make that identical shot that I've set up and spent time on, so that I have duplicates, in-camera dupes, if you will, from the days of film when we used to do that. So I'm a stickler.
Okay.
For good practices. Now, having said that, I was just teaching with my partner our Capitol Reef Escalante workshop this past late October, and there was a water puddle, and in order to get the low angle, my tripod, even though it goes flat to the ground, was still not low enough. And so I said, okay, I'm going to have to hand hold this, and I'm going to have to rest it on the rock next to the puddle, and I was going to have to do focus stacking. Well, sadly, it didn't work out so well, so you won't see that one in my portfolio, because even the slightest little bit of movement can cause a problem if you're trying to stack. It does align as best as it can, but it wasn't good enough, and the image was not tack sharp the way it would have been if it was on the tripod and nothing had moved. So next thing, I'm going to be bringing sticks of dynamite to make a hole deep enough that I can get the tripod low enough. No, just kidding. I mean, it's frustrating because, you think, okay, I got a tripod that goes flat to the ground, but then you have the ball head. And then
Right.
if you have an L bracket, or if you have a grip, all that still puts you 6 or 8 inches above the ground. And that's not where I needed to be. So it was a shot that just didn't work out, but it was nice seeing it.
One of the things you like to do is abstract photos. How does that work with nature, and particularly wildlife photography, or does it?
With wildlife photography, I think for me, I've seen some very creative techniques applied where it's motion blur, and I'm not talking just like a sharp shot of a horse running with the background blurred. that's technically, if it's well done, the horse is sharp and the background's blurred. And, that's like bicycle racers and runners and all of that. We've seen that for years. And so it takes a lot of practice to get just the right shutter speed and your tracking ability to be right on with the subject. So there's certainly craft involved. But the things that I have liked are where people, and I myself have done this too, where you slow down the shutter speed. So even though you're panning on your subject that's moving, your subject is not 100% sharp, but you show the sort of the motion and the energy of them moving, and the background's really blurred, which is nice. But the animal also has a more ethereal quality to it. Those are very difficult to create, and that's why you don't see tons of them out there, because I think we still, for some nature subjects, most of us still really like to see them sharper. But for fine art, dabbling in that more esoteric and ethereal kind of representation of wildlife can be very successful if you get it right. And it's just a little tricky. I think other nature subjects, especially for me, I love working with hillsides of trees, or forests in general, and gardens and foliage. I love to pan with a slow shutter speed on still subjects like that, because they create a brushstroke effect. I'm painting with light, but not by doing a long exposure on a tripod where I'm using a flashlight to paint with light. The light that's on the scene is being painted across the sensor by my slow shutter speed and my motion. And it creates a lot of brushstroke effects, the textures, and it's tricky still. You do a lot of them to get ones that still are representative of what you're looking at, but become more interpretive, more impressionistic. And there's a fine line between that. Some of my pictures give you the jitters because your eyes can't focus because there's not enough blur. There's just enough movement to make you dizzy, not enough blur to make it interesting. So those get thrown out as camera shake and failures, and occasionally I keep them as a comparison to what works and what doesn't work for my teaching.
I thought it would be fun to have you talk about some of the photos that you sent me. Speaking of abstracts, one of the ones you sent was an abstract of some trees in a forest. Looks like in fall, as some of the trees are turning yellow.
Mm-hmm.
You want to describe how you did that? And
yeah. First off, this is a recent one. I was in Slovenia leading my photo tour there just mid-October. And there's a combination of beech trees and larch trees. And in some cases, although in this image I think they're not really in there, some conifers, darker firs as well. But the larches are, they change colors, and so they go from a very pretty green to an orangey yellow by the end before they just drop all their needles. And the beech trees will go from yellow to a burnished orange. And so what you're seeing in there is the larches and the beech colors all sort of blended together. So I used a 1/6 of a second for that shot. I was using f11, and I was at 105 millimeters. So I was at the end of my 24-105, and I framed it. I looked at the scene. I did a swipe of the camera at probably the first ones I did might have been at a 15th of a second, because I find that has typically worked for me. 13th and 15th has worked very well. And I might have done that first one and decided that it was not enough blur to my liking. But it also gives me a chance to look at the composition. And you might think, what composition? How are you determining that when you're making this swooshy mess of it all, But you can see in that picture that there are defined shapes of some of the larches, and sort of the balance of dark and light it's not just a blurry mess. And so with some trial and error, I determined that a sixth of a second for the speed that I was moving for the area that I wanted to frame worked the best. So you just keep doing it, and it's not flailing. I mean, you could do it that way too, and you'd probably come out with a winner, but eventually, but it's still sort of predetermined thought as to what my focal length is, how much I'm going to need to move before I run into sky, or maybe below the trees I run into some light colored rock or dirt or something like a fallen log that running horizontally doesn't work very well. And so I have a window of space that I know I can work within to make the exposure. And then I just start practice runs, and then I start releasing the shutter after I've moved. So while I'm moving, I release the shutter, and that creates a smoother effect than if you try to release the shutter and then move, because in that nanosecond before you move, there's already some detail that's been recorded. And that can be fun. You can get different effects that way, but I find that most of mine are releasing the shutter while I'm already moving, and those have been the most effective.
So this was shot on a tripod?
No, this was not, because with a ball head, if you have to loosen it to go vertically, the whole thing is loose anyway, so what's the point? Now, if it was a fluid video head where you could release just the vertical movement, then a tripod would be certainly fine to do this, and it would give you the same left to right framing at least every time, but each time you moved the camera vertically, even if you're on a tripod, you would still get a different result. They're one of a kinds, and that's what I love about them, because when you get one that you really like, it's unique, and all the other ones around it that you might have are close, but not the one that you feel is the most to your liking. So, and it's fun to be free of the tripod, and this is one of those cases where it works to be free of it. I mean, you could go on an angle if you wanted to. I did a picture of a field of lupin this past spring here in California, where I moved the camera somewhat circularly, and all of the flowers look like little round spirally heads. And so instead of it being obvious that it's lupin, it's just an impression of a field of flowers, but done in a little different way. So that's kind of fun too. I'm not so sure that I'm sold on it being a great shot, but it's all experimentation when you're doing that to see what you like.
Looking at one of the other shots you sent me of a waterfall going into a pool, it looks like, and some fall color. And probably every photographer shoots waterfalls, but you've managed to capture something a little different and a little more interesting than the average waterfall composition. So how'd you go about doing that?
Well, I would say don't do this at home. Don't try this at home. Seriously, there were two of us, myself and one of my tour participants, and we worked on a buddy system, because where we had to stand, or how we got to where we're standing, was really a little dicey. And so we had to help each other down into this little spot and then take turns photographing. But it was in Slovenia, and the limestone, the karst formations there are wonderful because they're soft. The water over the eons has carved and sculpted these slot canyons, in a sense, out of the landscape of stone. And so you get these areas that are not unlike the sculpted rock that's in Glacier National Park, in Avalanche Creek, and the slot canyons of the Southwest. I mean, the same process is at work, where the stream is eroding away through the rock, and it finds the weakest point, and 100 million years later, it's cut through the rock and created this nice little cascade. And then we're lucky to be here to see it. And so I wanted depth because I really liked the fall color that was still on the trees in the background, and I wanted to show that this stream goes for quite a while, dropping, pooling up, dropping, and then ultimately falling into this lovely pool before, as you can imagine, it goes off out the left side of the frame and drops again into another series of cascades. So, that's kind of why I ended up with this larger landscape of this, and felt that it took you from the top of the frame, dropped down and through that little sluice, and then the way it hit splayed out really nicely with a slow enough shutter speed to give that effect. And it was like 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds for that. And then letting it just flow out the left side of the frame, because you can't stop it, and you can't get it all in the picture anyway.
And you've used the near to far technique again with the large rock on the right in sharp focus, and even the middle ground is in sharp focus, and then it kind of fades off to the fall color in the background, so
Right.
it just kind of leads your eye through the picture.
Yeah, and the idea was really, because of where I'm standing, to bring the viewer into the bottom of the frame where, of course, the eye goes to the brightest part of a picture. So your eye is drawn right to that final waterfall, and that puts you on the ledge looking at it. And then you just, like you said, you just follow up the stream back into the background. And it was a misty sort of day, so the background is even soft because as you got further back, you had more atmosphere between you and the camera. So that softened out a little bit back there to be just there and supporting the seasonal story, but not competing.
Great. Yep. I have to ask you about the picture with the snake in the sand. Definitely grabs your attention, but how did you do that without getting bitten?
Well, in Namibia, there's a wonderful tour that you can book outside of Swakopmund, based out of Swakopmund, and it takes you out into the coastal dunes. And you know how everybody talks about the big five in Africa as far as wildlife, lions and elephants and so forth. Well, this is the small five. The desert tour is really fascinating because the guides who run these trips are nuts, truly. But they have gone out and they have discovered the hidden life in the desert that you and I might never spot, because in many cases this snake would have been in a branch, up in a bush, waiting to attack something and sitting motionless, or only its head would be above the sand. And that's typically what this snake does, is it buries. And so I've frozen the action of it burying itself down into the sand to where only its nose and eyes would be out. So an unsuspecting chameleon or kangaroo rat or whatever other small critters they have walking by would not even realize it was there, or might not realize until it was too late. And that's how it will get its meals. So we discovered chameleons out there. They did. And they're not trained pets by any means, but the snakes, because they know where they hang out and where their burrow is, they can now repeatedly go back into the area where they were last spotted, and usually they can find them. They know how to read what they call the Bushman newspaper, which is all the tracks in the sand. So I'd love to say that I trudged through the desert sands for hours and was dying of thirst, when I came across this great snake burying itself in the sand. But no, we were driven out in four-wheel drive vehicles that went up and over the dunes, and we would wait until they found us something to photograph. But nonetheless, very, very fascinating, because we got to photograph the behavior and an animal or creature that we would not have been able to see otherwise. So it's very cool.
Hopefully you took this with a longer lens than it looks like.
Actually, I can check I was 183 millimeters. So yeah, but see, the snake wants, I mean, really, the snake wants to get away from you. It's not unlike our belief that snakes are out to get us. My belief has been that for a long time, They really just want to hide. They just want to get back and they want to get away from the hot sun. So they're burrowing in, and it's not in a coiled up strike position. And the size of the snake, since they generally can only strike about a third of their length, you know that you're safe enough. Nonetheless, it makes my toes tingle to get that close to snakes, very venomous ones. So, it was not without some trepidation. And I had image stabilization turned on because I was probably shaking because it's just freaky enough that, for me.
Yeah. It's interesting how the sand that it piled up around it kind of reinforces the curves of the snake and kind of acts as almost as a frame for the snake. So it adds a lot to it.
And it almost makes you think that there's more to that snake because it raised the ground, the sand is up. And so you think, oh my gosh, this thing is quite raveled up in there, that's a pretty big snake, when it really wasn't. I mean, it was maybe 16 inches long. So not as scary as it. Now I'm looking like a total wuss because who's afraid of a 16-inch long snake?
Most people probably.
Yeah, really.
Well, the next one's entirely different. It looks like a seashore somewhere with lots of colorful rocks on the left and waves coming in on the right. Talk about that one.
That is actually Lake Superior, and it's an intimate landscape, and the stones fascinated me. So I was working with patterns of the stones, but the wind had whipped up the waves. And I don't know how much you know about Lake Superior, but when big storms come through, the waves are like ocean waves, and they pack a powerful punch and they slam the shoreline. Well, in this case, they weren't doing that, but they were brisk enough that they were slapping the shore and rushing up and covering up the stones as they came in. And it was very reminiscent of being at the ocean, and yet you were lakeside. And so I just liked the texture of the water, knowing that when I slowed it down, I would get that brushstroke effect. And I liked that combined with the texture of the rocks that were on the beach. And so that is how I decided to make that combination. It was just really looking at that and saying, I like that opposing textures, if you will.
And the rocks are all wet, so the colors are very saturated, which helps make the picture, at least to my eye.
Yeah, I think that it enhances that for sure. And and just that it was an overcast day, perfect kind of light for that scene, because if you had sun, the highlights reflecting off of the surface of the water would have been like very bright white, almost like pen strokes, that can ruin a photo because they're so intense. And so soft light works really well because it blends that and more even highlight rather than a specular highlight. It blends that all together very nicely when you do a slow shutter speed.
Right. Yeah, I'm actually somewhat familiar with that part of the country. I spent a year in Duluth. So
Yeah. Well, that was up on Madeline Island.
Okay. So when you first see Lake Superior, it does look like the ocean because it stretches as far as the eye can see. So it's an
Oh yeah.
enormous lake.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty amazing. And because it's such a huge body of water, it actually behaves similarly in that there is actually a what I would call a tidal change. But what it really is depending on the way the wind's moving, the winds will push the water to the west or push it to the east or south or so forth, and that wind will just cause swells. And it's not much more than if you took a tub of water, and as you pull it towards you, the water races away from you and goes high on the back end of that tub, you know and that's sort of gravitational pull, I guess, that's doing that. But it's on a big scale. That's kind of what happens in Lake Superior. So they have what they call tides, which is really interesting.
Changing gears a little bit, I'm guessing this might have been done in Yellowstone. It's a scene with some clouds in the back and almost looks like a seashore again with some brownish light-colored material of some sort in the background and kind of gray in the foreground.
That image it's actually an aerial. It's an aerial over the tidal flats when you fly from Lake Clark, Alaska, back to Anchorage. And you're flying in a seaplane, so you're fairly low, you're not up in an airliner altitude. And we had clearing fog, and the light was breaking through the clouds of fog. And so that's what created all the dappled light. And the texture, the tiny texture that you see all over the foreground, the bottom part of the frame, is actually ripples from wind on the surface of the water. And that was it. And to me, it was just magical because it was abstract in the sense that you don't quite know, based on your description even, you're not quite sure what you're looking at, but it's moody and it seems ethereal and primordial with the fog in the background being backlit. So it would be right to think that it might be something in Yellowstone with geysers and steam and all of that. But in fact, it was just fog lifting off the tidal flats of Cook Inlet.
Wow. Yeah, the light there is just amazing.
Well, it's fun when I can fool somebody, and that's not, of course, the intent for a photo, but it's really just that opportunity. Most of the group were just looking out the window when we flew back, and I never get in that plane, coming or going, without my camera and my 24-105, because that's a good working range for me at the altitudes we fly at. And every single time I get at least one photograph that I love. One from 2 years ago actually took one of the high positions in the North American Nature Photography Association showcase competition. And it was the braiding of the rivers coming out into the tidal flat. And this particular stream had a lot of glacial silt in it. So it was a very turquoisey green, and there was some plants that were yellow all around it. And it was just one of those stunning shots of looking down at the earth from above.
All right. Yeah, I did a few of those when we were flying back and forth to Katmai too, but I haven't quite reached the elegance of yours, unfortunately.
Well,
but it was
thank you.
fun to do.
It is, and you just don't know, and you have to. I mean, I'm shooting through a window, so hopefully the window is going to be clean, and they do try to do that so that because they know photographers are going to be interested, and you have to watch out for reflections of yourself. I wear a black jacket, so that, and it's a fleece, not a shiny black jacket, so that I can minimize anything reflecting off the glass and hope that I'm getting seated on the proper side of the plane for the pictures that I'm ultimately going to want to get. Because, sometimes you end up facing the sun the whole time, and they're very, very difficult to make those photographs. But when they know that you're trying to make photographs, they sometimes will tilt the wings for us so that we get different angles. But they won't turn around and go back for me. I just haven't been able to get them to do that.
Probably if you paid them enough.
Probably, yeah. And if it was just me in the plane, that probably would work. But they have other people waiting to get picked up, so they can't. They have a schedule.
Sure. Okay, well, let's kind of wrap things up a bit. Where can people find you, your books, and all your photographs?
Well, I have 2 places for my photographs, actually 3, but my normal website, which is just www.brendatharp.com. I have some limited edition portfolios there. And then there I also have links to my other site, which is brendatharpphotography.com. And that is a smug mug site where I have more extensive galleries of all of the images that I have been actively posting. I've just put them up within the last 6 months. And so that's those 2 places you can see a lot of my work. You can also find me on Facebook and on Twitter. And then my latest book, Expressive Nature Photography, published by Monticelli Press, is sold through most bookstores and definitely online. If you want signed copies of it, it will be available only on my website, and the price is higher than, let's say, Amazon or Barnes & Noble. But if you want a signed copy, which makes a great gift for a photographer friend of yours or a photographer in your family, then you need to go to my website to get that.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for being on Photographing the West again, Brenda. It's always fun talking to you. And now, for a change of pace, I'll talk about our 50th podcast giveaway. So all you have to do to be entered is go to my website and sign up for my newsletter before December 15th. So go to www.flanaganphotos, spelled Photos.com, and sign up for the newsletter. Very easy to do. And then we'll draw 3 people's names from everybody that signed up by that date, and send you an email letting you know that you won and where to go to pick your winnings.
That sounds like a good deal for your readers and your followers.
Hopefully. So if you didn't catch the link, if you go to the show notes at www.photographingthewest.net, the information will all be in the show notes along with the photos that Brenda talked about, and so you can peruse those and admire those as well. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.